starting at the 22nd verse of 1 Peter. Now that you have purified yourselves by opening the truth, so that you have sincere love for your brothers, love one another deeply from the heart. For you have been born again, not of perishable seed, but of imperishable, through the living and enduring word of God. For all men are like grass, and all their glory is like the flowers of the field. The grass withers and the flowers fall, but the word of the Lord stands forever. And this is the word that was preached to you. Therefore rid yourselves of all malice and all deceit, hypocrisy, envy, and slander of every kind. Like newborn babies, crave sincere spiritual milk, so that by it you may grow up in your salvation, now that you have tasted that the Lord is good. As you come to him, the living stone, rejected by men, but chosen by God and precious to him, you also, like living stones, are being built into a spiritual house to be a holy priesthood, offering spiritual sacrifices acceptable to God through Jesus Christ. May God bless the reading of his word to our hearts and lives.
Good friends, it's a joy for me to be here with you today to help celebrate the 200th anniversary of Zion Church, or the two churches of Zion in North Canton, actually, or New Berlin, or this area of God's world, whatever you want to say. It's a joy for me, but it's also a responsibility for me to preach the good news of Jesus Christ, who saves us and the world to be healthy and whole and to be a community of followers of Jesus Christ. I chose a slight alteration to the assigned text for today, one of the assigned texts. There are probably 4 assigned texts for each Sunday. And I looked them up and said, okay, this makes sense. Living stones in a building for a 200th anniversary. That makes sense, doesn't it? You want to be a living stone? Let me just mention to you that I hope you do. But I realize too that I can make fun of that idea, as others will. Maybe you will make fun of that idea too. I don't know, never, right? I don't even know who I'm talking to, but he sure is good at making fun of things. Who wants to be a stone in a building? What a boring thing. I'm sure glad it says a living stone. But don't you want to be independent and on your own? Who wants to be part of something bigger? We're Americans and we can all stand all alone by ourselves, right? If you come at this life like that, I'll argue with you a little bit. As a matter of fact, I'll come back and preach another sermon if Eli and Gary will let me. If your counsel will let me, I'll come back and preach another sermon on how we are built to be part of a community. We are built to be together with other people. And if you don't believe that, I got a 20-minute sermon on that. What I am hoping today is that you and I will want to be part of God's church as living stones, pillars of the church, if you will. And believe me, that was always a great thing in the Beck household, to talk about the pillars of the church, whether it was here at Zion or in other places. Remember that in the church, the pillars are sturdy and faithful, but they, the pillars, live exciting lives with God. I grew up hearing of the Zeal for Zion. What a great name for a newsletter. What a great phrase. One of the Zion History says that it became the name of the newsletter over 100 years ago. So I don't think we Becks are claiming that one. But zeal, I looked it up in my American Heritage Dictionary. It had such a great definition that I didn't bother going anywhere else. Zeal is enthusiastic devotion. Enthusiastic devotion to a cause, an ideal, or a goal, and tireless diligence to its furtherance. What a great thing. Enthusiastic devotion and tireless diligence to make sure that thing, in this case, the Church of God and of Jesus Christ, is furthered. And then, of course, what's Zion? Well, it's this church right here, but it's also Jerusalem, the mountain of God, that is David's city, the center of the historic land of Israel, and the vision of a new Jerusalem, or even heaven. Zion, I want to remind you, is still a force in this community. It's not a power to throw its weight around and get people to conform. When you wish to spread God's love, you make a difference in North Canton and in the world. You get that? I'm saying you aren't here to push other people around. You're here to spread God's love. And when you do that, you are a force in this community. I must admit that when I think of my grandpa preaching, it was from right over there. I didn't hear him preach much. I had to listen to my dad, every week. But it was from right over there, and he started with good friends, and it was obvious that he loved those people, and he loved God more, and he wanted those people to love God too. That's the way it looked to me. So, for a while, I'd like to tell just a few stories and make a few comments about the Beck clan. Sorry about this, you're stuck. And I realize that this is going to drop in another, well, I think I have 14 minutes left. Okay. Here we go. I'm aware that I'm here representing my grandfather Melvin Beck, who I knew and loved. I think he died in my parents' house in 1969 at Thanksgiving time as I turned 22 and was beginning my first year at Eden Seminary in suburban St. Louis, Missouri. So I got to come home for Thanksgiving, which I never would have done before. I never would have done if he hadn't died, but I got to come home and be here for his funeral. Grandpa, according to my aunt's histories, was pastor here during the time when this church had its largest membership. He came to a church of 1,000 members in 1929 and retired in 1958, near the end of the 1950s. This church got up somewhere around 1,800 members, is my understanding, just from reading my aunt's stuff. But that's a time in the 1950s when a great number of men still remembered their times facing death in World War II and even the Korean War. Some of them vowed to God that if they got out alive, they would support the Church of Jesus Christ. And enough of them did that it may have been the time in our U.S. history with the highest church attendance and activity overall. You got that? Much more than when the nation was being founded. They weren't very religious then, no offense. A few of them were, sure, but a few of us always are. I was surprised a few years ago to find out that in Lake Township, in the area where I was in Uniontown, I mean, we're right down the road from Hartville, the old Amish and Mennonite community. We were below average in church attendance nationwide. We were about 30% nationwide, was 33 at that particular time. Shocking. And it's still the same around here. Friends, that was a different time in the 50s, as my father pointed out. Here are just a few stories about my grandpa Melvin. My Aunt Katie says that every Sunday noon he took attendance. Remember, this is for a church of over 1,000 members, almost 2,000. And if he and his good wife Ruth noticed someone missing, he might visit them Sunday afternoon or evening.
just to let them know they were loved and missed, and he sure hoped they were going to be back next Sunday. I never was able to follow up on that. And my churches were much smaller. When I came to Uniontown, someone, perhaps one of you from North Canton, from Zion Church, said they could remember watching Grandpa walk down the street, stopping at virtually every house of a parishioner, and they were many. And this person said he'd only spent 10 or 20 minutes with you, but he reminded you that God loved you and wanted you to live well. It was a smaller community, but he could walk the streets, and everybody knew him, and knew what he stood for, with no collar. Dad says that when Grandpa came to North Canton, he promised that his sermons would never be over 20 minutes, and that's literally what he said. The joke this morning in the choir room was that there's a trap door here, and after 20 minutes, little did he know what kind of history he was saying. Word was that his father was getting long-winded, going on and on, and so when Grandpa came in 1929, just before the stock market crash. I think it was before. It could have been just after. Not sure about that. He tried to preach short, 20 minutes. Grandpa was not the only pastor of this local church, but not only the pastor of this local church, but I wanted to mention that he was also periodically president of the Synod and volunteer presidents in those days, like the Eastern Ohio Association minister now, which we share now with Western Reserve, Rita Root. He was that. And he went around to other churches and did what he had to with them, sometimes not very happily, I might add, from what the family stories are. It seems to me that I heard one time that he said, "What that church needs is a few good funerals." He and Grandma hosted missionaries in their house, especially in Chicago, when they lived in Chicago before coming here, but also in North Canton. Grandpa wasn't much of a sportsman, but he went to high school sporting events to support his boys. That's the way Katie said. That was when high school sports were sports and not full-time lifestyles, and you didn't have to go every night of the week, There was usually basketball, baseball, football, and track, and he would go to some of those games just to be part of the community and to support the families. Grandpa invited members of Zion to place one candle in their house windows during Advent and Christmas to light the way for the Christ child. And Katie likes to say everybody in North Canton did that. One candle. Not all those candles that were in the old Lewis Miller house in Greentown, in every window, but just one candle to light the way for the Christ child. Now, some of you knew Grandpa much more as a pastor than I did. Truthful. So if you wish to tell me your stories, I'll try to be all ears for a time. Not forever, but for a time. Now, I almost didn't mention here any Chicago stories, but if you're willing to go beyond the 20 minutes, I want to tell you a few. At 6:45 this morning, I got up and wrote down a few memories my aunt and dad told us about Chicago, because I hadn't included it at all. Grandpa liked the lights of Chicago. He moved there before 1920 when my dad was born, and then moved out in 29. So he was there during the roaring 20s. And I mean, they were right there on Jackson Boulevard. If you look west from downtown, now that's Jackson Boulevard, right near the United Center where the Bulls play. And it's a rough neighborhood now, and it wasn't that different then. It was different. Not quite as rough as it is now, but it was rough. But he liked the lights of Chicago and loved the city and the people. They never owned a car, but they took trains. Grandma took her kids to Chicago Cubs games, bleacher seats, 25 cents. German Reformed ministers got together regularly, also putting them on train rides. As ministers' families, they played games and talked business, and the kids knew each other. Grandma enjoyed playing cards. If Grandpa could help it, and he could, she played rook with us, because in Chicago they knew real people who lost the family paycheck to card gambling. They were teetotalers until they died. Again, because alcohol hurt people they knew. One Chicago woman kept up with them until her dying day, and I think she lived in this area for a while, but then she went back to Chicago and all that, and she was a character, a bit of a flapper, and if you don't know what that is, look it up on your iPhone. And they loved each other in Christ. They lived in Chicago across the street from one of Al Capone's brothers, so they barely knew some of that gangster's nieces and nephews, and the gangland funerals came past their parsonage on Jackson Boulevard. One night on the street, Grandpa heard some young men come up behind him, sort of like the way Katie told it was on a street, and the buildings were all really close to the sidewalks, and there were sidewalks. And suddenly some guys came out of the door behind him, and he thought he was going to get robbed, but he heard, "Let's get out of here, it's the little preacher." They were Protestants in a neighborhood of Catholics and Jews. And there was a mutual respect for people they knew were religious. Another time a gangster came to talk to Grandpa in the parsonage, and the kids noticed, well, they were kids, you know. They left when they were 13 and 9 for North Canton. So they were somewhat younger than that, and probably a lot younger because they weren't yet in the parsonage. They had a landlord yet. So it's possible that my dad was like 4 years old or something like that when this happened. But this gangster came to talk to Grandpa in the parsonage, and they noticed because as the landlord knocked on the door, and he was long-winded and stood there talking to Grandma for quite a while, this gangster turned over the piano bench, crouched behind it, and drew a gun. Those kids remembered that. But Dad and Katie and perhaps Grandma were always frustrated because Grandpa never talked about that counseling session, who it was, or what they discussed. Not a word. They don't know who it is. They think it's Babyface Nelson, maybe, but they aren't sure. It was an exciting time in Chicago, and following Jesus meant struggle and learning and healing and peace and hope and living in the right ways. And I like to think that experience in Chicago with that kind of stuff going on helped develop a minister who could come here with some sense of knowing that he was following God. And he was going to follow God more than just the cultures of North Canton, which in that time were their own little thing. And very German, not at all Catholic and Jewish. So he was following God, and he could let some things ride with plenty of patience, because they didn't matter. Now, I said that some of you knew Grandpa more than I did as a pastor, and if you wish to tell me stories, I'll listen. I know that Grandpa took seriously God's call to him and to the church, and he still wants you to be a pillar of the church. I have two other stories. One about John. Now, John was an older brother to Edward, if he was an older brother to Edward. It says that in my aunt's histories, but I just don't remember that part of it. But John preached in many churches in this area, including Uniontown, where I spent 27 years and retired 3 years ago. John was in Uniontown in the 1870s just as the German-speaking church died out. Just for your history lessons, there were two churches in Uniontown, two German Reformed churches in Uniontown for a time. One was German-speaking and one was English-speaking. One allowed you to drink beer and one did not allow you to drink beer. And this was very important stuff to them. And the beer-drinking, German-speaking group eventually died out. So I pastored the other church. And I'm not sure John even pastored there. I'm not sure. Couldn't quite figure it out in the histories. It sort of sounds like the ministers went back and forth and sometimes ministered both churches, but other times it doesn't. You think we've got weird histories now, and we do. They had weird histories then too. But the story I want to tell you is that in the Uniontown Cemetery, I didn't get to take Amanda on a tour of the cemetery on Easter Sunday morning. We always take the confirmation class on tours of the cemetery there, and I try to point out various graves. And the oldest grave that I point out is one from 1877 with two of Reverend John Beck's children buried there. One was a few days old, one was a year and a few days old. What in the world happened? Why did these little girls, these aren't boys. Nurses will tell you that boys usually die more easily at birth and all that kind of thing. These are girls. How did they die? Why at about the same time? Good chance they got the flu. People died of the flu before penicillin. It was a regular thing. And those ministers and those congregations, those people face death on a regular basis. In a way, we don't. Yeah, we still talk about people who are in the hospital and people who are getting things done to them and all this kind of stuff. But I mean, they just killed off little kids with things like the flu. No problem. And so they looked to Jesus Christ, the pioneer and perfecter of their faith, for hope, so that whatever life they had, they could use it well to God's glory. You got it? I mean, you don't expect to die in the next 3 days just because you get the flu, or 3 weeks, but they did. And it pushed them into faith in Jesus Christ. Second story is about Edward. I'm going to have to find it here since I'm moving all over the place. A few years ago, my Aunt Catherine mentioned to me that her grandfather, Reverend Edward Beck, used to say, "Love should be reserved for God and people. You just like everything else." And I preached on that more than once. I imagine Michelle and Amanda remember those, because I went on it for a month, maybe 2 months, and then I'd periodically come back to it. I still think that's a tremendously important teaching from Edward Beck, 1916 to 1929 here, and then he retired into North Canton too. Today, advertisers and salespeople try to get us to love things they're selling. They say, "Oh, I love that house. I love that dress. I love that sandwich. I love that car." Really? I like houses and dresses. My kids moved yesterday into a new house over by the explosion in Hartville, right Bicentennial's golf course, for those of you who are going to be golfing over there. And I like that house. I love it. My dad's been able to move from a big house into Croft Commons, independent living at Chapel Hill, and now into the nursing home just a few weeks ago, because I think he has pushed himself to say he likes houses. He doesn't love them. He doesn't have to live in one all of his life. If you need to move, you move. Right? I like houses and dresses. I say I try to love the people who live in them. If you guys, if there are any young guys trying to impress girls around here, whenever you see her in a really nice dress, you say, oh, that is a nice dress. But you know I love you more than I like the dress. I sometimes like sandwiches. I like Jerry Smith's food. I try to love the people who make it, prepare it, eat it. Or sometimes the people who do not have the opportunity to eat food for various reasons. Love people and God like everything else. I'm still hoping and praying that God will spread that custom in Zion Church and actually the Church Universal. I'm praying that God will cause the same truth to spring up elsewhere, and eventually we Christians will all be known as the people who love God and people and like everything else, even if that causes salespeople to curse us. So, do you want to be a living stone in God's church? I hope and pray that you do, and that you will. I apologize for not preaching the gospel and really getting into some more of what it means to be living stones, but I just wanted to tell those stories this morning, and I think there is something in them about what it means to be living stones and pillars of the church. I grew up in a family that enjoyed each other's company and made a point to enjoy each other's company because they believed in good news that they got from Jesus Christ. They felt that God loved them enough that they were going to spread it to their family. And that's what I hope you do in Zion Church and in the rest of your life. Even when you're facing Catholics and Jews and Muslims and Hindus and Buddhists and all those people who don't really care about God or religion or anything and are just trying to base their actions on their emotions. So thanks for listening to a few stories, and I pray that you will be living stones